welcome everybody to Orange County Coastkeeper's streams. Today, Colin and I are going to be giving a little update on the EPA enforcement policy during COVID-19 and how the federal government, the state government, and Coastkeeper is or is not enforcing environmental regulations right now. I'm sure you all have heard a lot in the news about the EPA basically suspending enforcement of environmental regulations due to COVID-19. And so we're just here to provide some updates on what's going on with that. So on March 26th, the EPA sent out a memo that said they would not be assessing any civil penalties against any regulated entities for failure to conduct their routine monitoring, reporting, and other requirements of environmental regulations if the EPA agrees that COVID-19 was the cause of non-compliance. So this is the memo from the EPA explaining what their new enforcement policy is and just explaining the reasons that they are going to accept non-compliance. And it's not quite as blanket as some of the news stories make it seem, but it certainly gives them a wide discretion to not assess civil penalties for violations that otherwise would maybe have mandatory penalties or automatic penalties. And it gives themselves a lot of leeway, basically. So there's obviously a gap here in environmental enforcement. And specifically, like I said before, one of the big things is that they are not requiring, or I'm sorry, they are not going to be assessing civil penalties, which is really kind of the teeth behind environmental regulations. And I will share a link if you guys want to read this more in detail. But yeah, so Colin, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and the information, this is really important for one really big reason. Well, for a few reasons, one of which is this policy is retroactive, so it went back about a week, about 10 days, saying that any of these, what would ordinarily be violations of the Clean Water Act, are not going to be held as violations for purposes of enforcement through EPA's discretion. And it said during the period of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the effects of pollution last longer than any pandemic, especially this one. Let's say we reopen in June. That doesn't necessarily mean that the impacts of the pollution that were discharged during this memo's duration are also going to stop being harmful at the time that this memo is rescinded. So there are many toxic, harmful pollutants that are discharged from facilities, and it's through monitoring that the public is made aware that these things are occurring. And so the discharger is made aware that they're occurring. And at that time, they can start making the necessary changes to their activities to make sure that things like bacteria or toxic pollutants, chemicals, aren't put into the waterway at what either is called a chronic or an acute level. So chronic, a little bit over a longer period, and then acute would be a lot just in a sudden burst. You might have a tank that's burst or something. That information's useful for the public, but also for the discharger, because that way they know that, you know, maybe some of their products going down the drain instead of collecting it and being able to sell it. This is like the first stage towards protecting water quality. The issue that we have on this is that while it is temporary, there's no duration that's really laid out in the memo. This could be a temporary policy for the rest of the year, until there is a vaccine, until the Trump administration's over. We don't know, right? This is discretionary, yet the impacts are known. Each of these permits, a permit is a license. So if someone has a license, if someone has a permit to discharge, you know they have pollutants. So these aren't facilities that could be discharging really clean water, right? You know that there's a potential that these facilities in particular have a likelihood that they're discharging pollutants in a level that could be harmful. So not holding them responsible for failing to sample could be sending a really bad message to these operators that they don't need to comply. And that's what we need to make sure that we are protecting ourselves from. One of the other issues that we have a lot of concern about is that we're all at home for the most part right now. And why is that? It's the early information that was not actionable by those in a position of power that have forced all of us to stay home, right? So early warnings are important so mitigation can be put into place. And without that early information, we can't do that. It's important to know, though, that we do live in an area in the state of California, and other states too have done this. And they've said, thank you, EPA, but we're going to do more. So we're going to require people to continue monitoring unless there's, the labs are shut down, or you're in a facility where you truly can't do it because you have a COVID outbreak or something. There's a real threat, then sure, don't do it. But if you're operating your machineries, if you're selling product, you should be able to send somebody out during a rainstorm and collect a stormwater sample, right? This policy, if California didn't do this, if Southern California, if this was the EPA's policy was our policy, then this last storm event that hit in Southern California, we might not have any results from that. And that was a big storm that should produce a lot of information that should be actionable. But states like Arizona, they're administered not by the state, their environmental policies, but by the EPA directly. They're not going to have that kind of information. There's another final thing I'll say about this is we have a concern too, because in the policy, there is a veiled threat to the states like California not to conduct inspections for the duration of the policy. It says directly, the EPA will take the COVID-19 pandemic into consideration in any review of a state compliance and enforcement program, such as the state review framework. This can be interpreted as a threat from the feds. Don't do inspections. Otherwise, when your state comes up for review, we might not reauthorize you to implement the regulations from EPA congressional mandates. So this could have a chilling effect on the state's proactive stance on protecting air and water quality.
Yeah, and I've actually heard from some of the regional water boards that they have been instructed not to do any field inspections right now. And as Colin had mentioned, part of the problem with that is, even though we are dealing with this pandemic, we don't understand how the virus might be transferred through water. It's especially important to maintain air quality. They're finding places with poor air quality, which cause respiratory infections, that the COVID-19 virus has more of an effect on those communities. And so it's more important than ever that we continue enforcing our environmental regulations. And so luckily in California, Cal EPA has issued a separate statement. And actually, looks like this was issued today. And Cal EPA's statement says, we are still enforcing environmental regulations here. You are required, if you are a regulated entity, you are required to comply with the terms of your permit. And there's a variety of permits that the regulated community has, whether it be air permits or water permits, that basically regulates the amount of pollution that they can put into the environment. And for California, both through Cal EPA and through the State Water Board, they have said, if there's a reason that you cannot comply because a laboratory is closed or you cannot sufficiently and safely staff, notify us immediately and we will get back to you with a response on whether or not that's acceptable within 24 to 48 hours. And so California is still trying to put the message out to the regulated businesses, hey, the federal EPA might not be doing enforcement right now, but we fully expect you to continue complying with your environmental permits, with your discharge permits, be it for air or water. And I know that the Regional Water Board sent out an email to all of the regulated entities under the Industrial Stormwater Permit, which is one of the main permits that Coastkeeper enforces, notifying everybody that they're completely responsible for continuing to monitor as they should, and that environmental monitoring is considered essential business. So
this is an important issue, because you might also hear, well, this doesn't apply to facilities that are conducting the treatment of waste. So like publicly owned treatment works, so a sewage plant, right? And you might have been hearing something about, well, there might be elements of this virus that continue in waste, but at least that waste is going to a sewer, it's going to be treated before it gets discharged. That might be the case, but some of these facilities that we have a special concern about are like waste facilities that would be trash collection sites. You put your trash out in front of your street, that's taken away. And those of us who have, children, or those families who have people who have been going through something like prostate surgery, very common, or those who might have family members who live with them who are elderly, and have all of these families might be dealing with people who have diapers that are frequently going on in their house, being used in their house, being disposed of. Those don't go to a sewer. They go to a street. The street, it gets cleaned up by the sanitation district, taken to an industrial site. And it's the industrial permit that controls the waste that comes off of those sites during a rain event. And if that site isn't doing what it needs to be doing, you have untreated human waste leaving these sites, going into storm drains, streets, storm drains, and a beach near you. And if there are any elements of virus in these things, we need to make sure that all of the sources are being dealt with, not just, wastewater treatment facilities, because that's not the only place where this virus and other things might be able to be found. And by telling people, don't worry about monitoring, that's sending exactly the wrong kind of message in a situation like this.
yeah, and frankly, a lot of these places, they contribute pollutants into our environment on a daily basis, or at least when it rains, which is why Coastkeeper and the enforcement staff, Colin and I, are constantly monitoring industrial facilities for pollution, because whether there's a pandemic or not, nobody wants those types of materials running into their rivers and into the beaches where they recreate. And so even though the federal EPA has said we are not enforcing, they have specifically pointed out that consent decrees with citizen suits, that would be a Coastkeeper settlement, that those are still fully regulated by the federal court, and that the EPA has no jurisdiction over those. And so just something to maybe hopefully make you feel a little bit better. Even in ordinary times, citizen suits are responsible for the majority of enforcing environmental regulations in the state of California. For stormwater, for the stormwater permit that we've been talking about, California Coastkeeper Alliance has reported that over the past 5 years, 83% of stormwater penalty enforcement cases in California were filed by private citizens. And that's groups like Orange County Coastkeeper, Inland Empire Waterkeeper, and our fellow keepers up and down the coast. And these lawsuits provided $8.8 million in funding for environmental projects that benefit communities harmed by pollution, addressed by the case. So even under ordinary circumstances, there's not a lot of enforcement going on from the federal EPA. Orange County Coastkeeper is here. We're working, even though we're working from home, we are still working to make sure that our communities are safe, and we're still there to make sure that the regulated entities know that they have a continuing obligation to comply with their permits.
Yeah, and the same state water board published a document analyzing the third-party enforcement, as Sarah was talking about. And when they reviewed a lot of these documents to figure out what like a best management practice would be for third parties bringing these kind of actions, they looked at organizations like ours and actually used some of our consent decrees and other consent decrees from water keepers around the state. And that also influenced the latest iteration of the stormwater permit that regulates all facilities in the state of California that are industrial and discharged to a waterway. So, and that permit also, or that document also said that It's through third-party enforcement that holding polluters responsible. That was complementary of the state board's mission and fully within the spirit of the Clean Water Act citizen suit provision and the goals of the Clean Water Act. So Orange County Coastkeeper is also unique because we have members in jurisdiction in 5 of the 9 regional boards in California. So we have a lot of members. We have a lot of discussions with different regional boards about sort of their own best practices and how to improve water quality and hold polluters accountable. And I'd conclude by saying, for those who wish to support Coastkeeper's ability to serve our members and protect water quality, please visit coastkeeper.org and make a donation to the Clean Water Fund or our general operating support, because we understand that everybody who's watching this has COVID-19 related issues going on. It's hitting everyone's pocketbooks. A lot of people are very scared and frightened during this time. It is hitting everybody hard, including organizations like Coastkeeper. If you have the ability to provide any financial support, or just go to our Facebook and say, hey, good job, you know, we appreciate what you're doing, I'd encourage you to do that. You know, everybody needs a little bit of support, and we'd like a little of your support, however that might come over the next few days.
Yeah, and you can also sign up to become a member of Orange County Coastkeeper or Inland Empire Waterkeeper or Coachella Valley Waterkeeper. You just go to our website, it's it's coastkeeper.org, and sign up to be a member and support our actions to enforce clean water. I don't know if we can take questions. I'm not seeing the chat button at the bottom of my screen. Let's see. But you can always send me an email if you have questions. It's sarah@coastkeeper.org. Be happy to answer your questions, and we'll still be here working.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Good day.